the middle of war, sometimes the bravest men don't wear medals. They wear soot. A train thundered through the cold European night. Dim light from the cabin spilled out, casting faint shadows across the weathered face of Otto Weber, an ordinary German train driver. But beneath the floorboards lay something no one could have imagined, a secret that could alter the course of the war. Each time he blew the whistle, it wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. And every journey he made was a gamble between life and death. The train's whistle broke through the silence of the countryside, a steady, familiar sound that had become a part of the rhythm of life during those days of war. But on this particular night, as the dark, rolling hills passed by, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, as though the earth itself could sense the weight of history bearing down on it. The train was carrying more than just freight. It carried secrets that could change the course of the war. Otto Weber, the train conductor, had been running the same route for years, long before the war had taken hold of every part of his life. He was a man of routine, methodical, precise, quiet. But under the surface of that calm exterior, Otto had become something else. A reluctant hero, a keeper of secrets, someone whose every move was watched by forces much larger than him. He had seen the devastation that came with the Luftwaffe's bombings, heard the explosions that shook the earth, and saw the smoke rise from cities like London and Coventry. But he wasn't a soldier, not really. He wasn't on the front lines, didn't carry a weapon or wear a uniform. No, Otto was just a conductor, a man who spent his days guiding his trains safely from one station to another. But even in that quiet routine, the war had found its way in. And soon, Otto found himself caught in the midst of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. The year was 1943, and the Wehrmacht's grip on Europe was as tight as ever. The Blitz had scarred Britain, the Luftwaffe's bombers still ruled the skies, and every day felt like a struggle for survival. But in the midst of all this, Otto had come into contact with a resistance network, a quiet underground group that operated in the shadows. He wasn't looking for trouble. He had never asked for any part in the war. But like so many others, he found himself caught in the current, swept along by the tides of history. It all started one evening, after Otto's shift. He was walking back to his small apartment, his boots clicking on the cobblestone streets. He passed the usual sights, the dimly lit pub, the quiet homes of his neighbors, all of them unaware of the dangers looming overhead. The world outside seemed calm, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. As Otto reached his door, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Jakob, a young man he had seen around the train station. Jakob was different. His eyes were filled with a quiet intensity that Otto had learned to recognize. He was part of something Otto had heard rumors about but never dared to understand. Resistance, rebels, heroes. Jakob's words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "You have a job to do, Otto," Jakob said, his voice low and urgent. "It's time." The words hit Otto like a punch in the gut. He had known deep down that this day would come, but he had never wanted it. He was a simple man, a worker. All he wanted was to keep his family safe and out of the crossfire. But there was no turning back now. Jakob handed him a small, weathered map, a few scraps of paper, and a simple instruction. Change the signals. The rest would fall into place. Otto's mind raced as he stood there in the cold night air. Change the signals. It sounded so simple, so insignificant, but the weight of it was immense. He wasn't just a train conductor anymore. He was a part of something bigger, something dangerous, and every time he blew the whistle on his train, he would be making a choice. A choice to resist. The next few days passed in a blur. Otto knew what he had to do. He had to get to the signal box before dawn, change the track switches, and send a signal to the resistance. It wasn't just about helping them escape. It was about sending a message. He was helping them disrupt the Luftwaffe's supply lines, helping them get crucial intel to the Allies. It was small, but in the grand scheme of things, it mattered. One fateful evening, the train left the station just like any other. Otto stood in the conductor's booth, his hands on the controls, eyes scanning the tracks ahead. But this time, there was a difference. The train was carrying something more than just cargo. It was carrying a message. And as the train rumbled down the tracks, Otto's mind kept returning to the same question. What if they found out? What if the SS were watching? He didn't have answers, but he knew that it was too late to stop now. Hours later, as the train came to a stop at its destination, Otto received word that the operation had been a success. The Germans had been thrown off course. The Luftwaffe's plans had been disrupted. For the first time in weeks, Otto felt a flicker of hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it felt like a victory. But Otto wasn't the kind of man who celebrated victories. There was always another train to catch, another task to complete. And so, he went back to his work just as he always had. The war raged on, the bombers still flew overhead, and the world kept turning. But in the quiet of the railway station, in the hum of the train's engine, Otto had made his choice. He had chosen to fight, not with weapons or violence, but with small, quiet acts of defiance. And sometimes, that was enough. As he sat in the conductor's booth, listening to the rhythmic sound of the train's wheels, turning, Otto thought of Jakob, thought of the resistance, thought of the war. And he knew deep down that this was his fight. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. But in that moment, Otto Weber had made a difference. And that was all anyone could ask for. In the distance, the train's whistle echoed through the darkening night, a sound of both sorrow and defiance, signaling that the fight wasn't over yet. Not for Otto. Not for any of them. And so the train rumbled on, its destination uncertain, its purpose clear. The war had a way of seeping into everything, into the soil, into the air, into the minds of those who lived through it. It was a quiet, suffocating weight, a hum in the background of everyday life. For Otto Weber, the train conductor, it was always there, pressing down on him even as he went about his routine. The world around him had changed, irrevocably, and he had been swept up into it, a man with no interest in heroism, no desire for fame, just a worker, like so many others. But when the war came knocking, when it forced itself into his life, Otto found himself standing at the precipice of something much greater than he could have imagined. The year was 1943. The Luftwaffe still ruled the skies, its bombers casting long shadows over the cities below. The Blitz, that relentless aerial campaign, had already laid waste to London, Coventry, and countless other towns. Every night, the sound of distant engines would fill the air, a harbinger of the death that followed in their wake. Otto had seen it all. He had lived through it, borne witness to the destruction of his homeland. But he had also lived through the small victories, the subtle ways in which ordinary people fought back. And now, here he was, part of that struggle, though he would never have asked for it. The factory where Otto worked was no different from the others. It hummed with the sounds of machines, the constant rattle of steel, the rhythmic pounding of hammers against metal. The air smelled of oil and sweat, a thick industrial scent that seemed to permeate everything. But beneath that noise, beneath the hum of engines and the clatter of production, something far more dangerous was taking place. Otto had been asked to do something he never thought possible. Something that would place him squarely in the crosshairs of the war. It was Jakob, the young man from the station who had come to him one night, his eyes wide with urgency. Otto could see the fear in his face, but there was something else there too, a quiet resolve. Jakob had handed him the map, folded and crinkled from use, and explained it all. How the Germans were routing vital supplies, how they were using the trains to transport ammunition and weapons, how Otto's own trains would be carrying cargo that could turn the tide of the war. It was simple. Change the signals, redirect the trains, give the Allies a chance to strike. Otto's hands had trembled as he looked over the map, the weight of the decision settling into his chest. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a spy. He was just a man who drove a train. But the truth was, in those days, there was no such thing as just a man. Everyone had a role to play, whether they liked it or not. For Otto, it was this. He would change the signals. He would help the resistance. And he would do it quietly, without drawing attention to himself. It wasn't about the grand gestures. It wasn't about fame or glory. It was about survival. About doing what he could, in whatever small way, to push back against the enemy. But every time he thought about the consequences, about the dangers of what he was about to do, he couldn't shake the image of his wife, Maria, and their 2 children, waiting for him at home. Would they understand? Would they forgive him if things went wrong? But there was no turning back. Otto knew that. Once he had agreed to this, once he had taken on this role, there was no going back. He had chosen to resist, to fight. And in doing so, he had stepped onto a path that would lead him into the heart of something far greater than anything he had ever imagined. Every night, after his shift, Otto would make his way to the signal box. It wasn't far from the station, just a short walk through the cold streets. The faint echo of his boots on the cobblestones, the only sound. He had memorized the route, his mind sharp with the details of what needed to be done. Each turn, each switch, each signal, it had to be done exactly right. There could be no mistakes. He couldn't afford to be seen, couldn't afford to make a single error. One wrong move, and the entire operation would fail. The SS were everywhere. They were always watching. Otto's heart would race as he worked, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. Every time he changed the signal, he would hold his breath, listening for the sound of footsteps, for the crackle of a radio. The trains carried not just ammunition, but lives, lives that could change the course of the war. His work, though small, though unnoticed, had become a part of something much larger. And in that, Otto found his purpose. It wasn't much, but it was something. The nights were long, and the tension never seemed to fade. He had become part of the invisible army, the people who fought in the shadows, who worked without recognition, who risked everything without ever stepping onto the battlefield. The war had taught him many things. It had taught him the value of silence, the importance of discretion. It had taught him that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that are never seen. One night, as Otto sat alone in the signal box, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of engines overhead. The Luftwaffe was coming. He could feel it in his bones, that familiar sense of dread that crept in whenever the sky darkened with their presence. Otto's hand trembled as he adjusted the signal, guiding the train off the main track. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It meant the Allies could strike. It meant there was hope. The rumble of the train as it moved along the tracks was the only sound that filled the space. Otto didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew what he had to do. He had chosen to resist, and in doing so, he had chosen to fight back. Not with guns, not with violence, but with small, quiet acts of defiance. Each time the whistle of his train echoed through the night, it wasn't just a train, it was a signal of hope, a signal that the war wasn't over yet. And so, as Otto sat there, staring out at the tracks stretching into the darkness, he knew that whatever came next, whatever dangers lay ahead, he had done his part. He had fought back in the only way he knew how, by keeping the trains running, by making sure that each signal was sent, each message received. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man doing his part, trying to make a difference in a world that seemed to have lost its way. As the sound of the engines faded into the distance, Otto sat in the stillness, the weight of the night pressing down on him. It was done, for now. But the war was far from over. And as the trains rumbled on, Otto knew one thing for certain. The fight was never truly over. Not for him. Not for any of them. And so, with that thought, he settled into the quiet of the night, ready for whatever came next. And somewhere, in the distance, the sound of the train's whistle echoed, a promise of what was to come. The sound of the train's whistle echoed through the still night, its mournful cry mingling with the distant rumblings of artillery far away, a constant reminder of the war that had engulfed Europe. Otto Weber, standing at the helm of his locomotive, felt a deep knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The tracks stretched out before him, endless and dark. But they were also a lifeline, a thin thread that connected the present to the past, the familiar to the unknown. As the train sped along, its heavy wheels slicing through the night, Otto couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. It had been nearly 2 years since the war had fully entered their lives. The Luftwaffe had first launched the Blitz against London in 1940, and from then on, it seemed as if the whole of Britain had become a battlefield. The skies, once so peaceful, now roared with the sound of bombers, their dark silhouettes casting shadows over everything below. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, in the midst of a world torn asunder by blitzkrieg, Otto had found himself inexplicably drawn into something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. It wasn't by choice, of course. No one asked to be a hero. In fact, Otto had never thought of himself as anything more than a simple train conductor, doing his job day in and day out. His hands were calloused from years of work in the factory and on the rails, and his face, though lined with age, held a quiet resolve. He had never sought the spotlight, never craved the glory that war seemed to promise to those who fought on the front lines. But here he was, caught in the web of the resistance, a quiet cog in the machinery of a war that seemed determined to consume everything in its path. At first he had resisted. The thought of becoming involved in something as dangerous as espionage was something he could hardly stomach. He had a family to care for, his wife, Maria, and their 2 young children. What would they do if something went wrong? But in the end, it had been impossible to turn away. The resistance had a way of finding those who were needed, and Otto, with his access to the train system, had been too valuable to ignore. The signal box had become his battleground. Every night, as the train rattled through the darkness, Otto would slip away to change the signals. It was a small thing, a subtle thing, but it mattered. By redirecting the trains, he was ensuring that valuable German supplies were sent off course, leading to confusion among the Wehrmacht. The Luftwaffe would be deprived of the resources they needed to continue their raids, and the Allies would have a fighting chance. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Otto, that something was all he had. He had never seen the war up close. He hadn't been at Dunkirk or in the trenches of France. But in his own quiet way, Otto had been fighting the enemy for months. The tracks beneath him were his battlefield, and the train, his weapon. Every time he set the switches, every time he altered the course of the trains, Otto knew he was helping to push back against the storm that was threatening to swallow his country. The war, however, was never far from his mind. The trains, once a symbol of movement, of progress, had become symbols of destruction. Each train that passed carried more than just cargo. It carried the weight of war itself. Weapons, ammunition, supplies. Every journey felt like a gamble. Every whistle of the train, every stop at a station, held the potential for disaster. A wrong move, a slip-up, and Otto would be discovered. The Gestapo was everywhere, watching, waiting, ready to crush anyone who dared to oppose the regime. But in the quiet of the train cabin, in the sound of the wheels turning, Otto found solace. The train was his sanctuary. It was a place where he could focus, where he could think. The constant movement of the train, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks beneath him, was like a heartbeat, steady and predictable. But underneath that calm exterior, Otto felt the rising tide of fear and responsibility. Each time he pulled the lever to change the signal, it was as if he was writing a new chapter in his own story. A chapter that could end at any moment. It wasn't just the Germans who watched the trains. The resistance had its eyes on Otto, too. Jakob, the young man who had first introduced him to the network, had been the one to bring the map, to explain the mission. Otto could still remember the way Jakob's eyes had gleamed with determination, a look that had been both inspiring and frightening. Jakob had insisted that Otto was the only one who could do this, that the success of the operation depended on him. Otto had tried to resist, but the truth was, he had already made up his mind. How could he turn away from something that, deep down, he knew was right? As Otto sat at the controls, steering the train through the night, he often found himself thinking about the choices he had made. The war had changed everything: his country, his family, his very sense of identity. He had once been content to live a quiet life, working with his hands, tending to his family. But now, everything had shifted. The war had forced him to act. He had chosen to resist, not with weapons or violence, but with his mind, with his ability to understand the inner workings of the railway system. Every time he altered the course of a train, every time he changed the signals, he was striking back at the heart of the enemy. But Otto knew he wasn't alone in this struggle. He thought of the countless other men and women who were working in the shadows, doing what they could to fight back. The resistance wasn't just made up of soldiers and spies. It was made up of everyday people, like Otto, who had decided that they could no longer sit idly by. It was the quiet actions, the small moments of defiance that ultimately made a difference. And so, every night, Otto went to work, knowing that his small contributions were part of something much bigger than himself. The train moved steadily forward, its wheels clattering rhythmically as the night unfolded before them. Otto glanced out the window, the flickering lights of distant towns passing by. The sky was dark, the stars barely visible through the heavy clouds. He could almost hear the distant sound of the Luftwaffe, their engines buzzing in the night, but he refused to let fear take hold. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. There was work to be done. As the train continued its journey, Otto sat back, his hands resting on the controls, his thoughts drifting. He had never asked for any of this. He hadn't signed up to be a hero. But sometimes, the weight of the world fell onto the shoulders of the most unlikely people. And in that moment, as the train rumbled forward, Otto knew that what he was doing mattered. No matter how small the act might seem in the grand scheme of things, every turn of the wheels, every shift in the track was a small victory in a war that seemed so vast, so unending. And for Otto, that was enough. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a general, he was just a man doing his part. But in that quiet, steadfast way, Otto Weber was fighting a battle that would resonate long after the war had ended. The sound of Otto's boots echoing on the cobblestone streets was the only noise breaking the silence of the night. The town around him was still, as though the air itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen, something inevitable. He had made the choice. He had agreed to help, and now there was no turning back. The fate of so many rested on his shoulders, though none would ever know the sacrifice behind it. No medals, no applause, just the sound of a train whistle cutting through the fog of war. Each night, the train he drove felt heavier. The cargo, the passengers, he had grown used to it all. But this new weight, this burden of secrecy, was unlike anything he had ever carried before. Otto wasn't sure when exactly he had become a part of something bigger than himself. Maybe it was when Jakob had first approached him with that folded map, its edges frayed from countless hands. Or maybe it was the first time he had changed a signal, redirecting a train toward the unknown, sending it into uncharted territory. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that every journey, every stop, carried the potential for change. The war was never far from Otto's thoughts. He had seen the bombings, the devastation, the constant threat of the Luftwaffe overhead. The Blitz had torn through London, Coventry, and beyond, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. Otto could still hear the roar of German bombers, their engines a constant reminder of the looming danger. And yet, even amidst this destruction, there was something else. A quiet resistance, a determination that refused to be silenced. The resistance wasn't just a group of soldiers. It wasn't a handful of men with guns and explosives. It was made up of everyday people, people like Otto, who found ways to resist the enemy without ever stepping onto a battlefield. They were the ones who changed the course of history in small, quiet ways, and Otto had become one of them, though he would never have called himself a hero. There were no great speeches, no dramatic moments. Instead, there were the whispers, the secret meetings, the quiet conversations in dark corners of factories and train stations. And every time Otto changed the signal, every time he sent another train off course, he knew that his small act of defiance was part of something much larger. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope in the face of despair. The train rumbled through the night, its wheels clattering against the rails as Otto focused on the path ahead. His mind, however, kept returning to the night Jakob had first approached him, to the moment when everything had shifted. The war had changed everything. It had changed the way people thought, the way they lived. But it had also changed Otto. He wasn't just a conductor anymore. He wasn't just a man trying to survive. He was part of a much larger effort, a secret struggle against the darkness that threatened to swallow Europe whole. The resistance had no face, no uniform. It wasn't something you could point to on a map or find in a history book. It was a network of people, some with obvious roles, others hidden in the shadows, doing what they could to fight back. The messages Otto sent, the signals he altered, were tiny pieces of a much larger puzzle. It wasn't just about stopping trains or disrupting supplies. It was about giving the Allies an edge, an opportunity to strike when the Germans least expected it. It was about undermining the enemy from within, slowly chipping away at their power until it crumbled from the inside. Otto didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if his small actions would make any difference in the grand scheme of things, but he knew that he couldn't stand by. He couldn't let the war happen around him without doing something. Each time he changed the signal, he thought of the faces of the men and women in his country, the faces of those who had suffered under the weight of the Luftwaffe's bombs. He thought of Maria, his wife, who waited for him at home. unaware of the risk he was taking. He thought of their children, who had grown up in a world where the sky was never safe, where every day was a struggle for survival. And in that moment, as the train sped down the tracks, Otto made a silent vow. He would do what he could to change the tide, no matter how small the victory. But there were moments when the weight of it all became too much. Otto had always been a man of routine. He had spent his life guiding trains down the same tracks, watching the same scenery pass by. The rhythm of the train had been his anchor, the sound of the whistle a constant companion. But now, each journey was a reminder of the choices he had made. The train no longer felt like a machine. It felt like a lifeline that carried not just him, but the hopes of so many others. One night, as Otto sat in the signal box, waiting for the next train, the familiar click of the switch felt heavier than usual. He had been doing this for months now, but tonight, something felt different. The weight of his actions seemed to press down on him, and for the first time, he questioned everything. Was this enough? Was this small act of defiance really making a difference? Or was he just one man, powerless against the tide of history? The answer came in the form of a distant rumble, the unmistakable sound of engines in the sky. The Luftwaffe. Otto's heart skipped a beat. He had seen the planes before, heard the distant hum of their engines, felt the ground shake beneath their weight. But tonight, it was different. This time, he knew he was part of something larger. This time, he wasn't just a spectator. He was a participant in the struggle for survival. As the train moved forward, the sound of the wheels on the tracks became a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Otto's hand rested lightly on the controls, his eyes focused on the path ahead. There was no turning back. The choices had been made. But in the quiet of the night, as the train sliced through the darkness, Otto knew that, for now, this was enough. The war would go on. The bombs would fall. The Luftwaffe would continue its raids. But in this moment, Otto had made a difference. He had fought back in his own way, quietly, without fanfare, without recognition. But it had been enough. The wind outside howled as the train picked up speed, its engine roaring into the night. Otto felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The war had changed everything, but in this moment, the world felt as it always had, with the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic click of the tracks beneath him. It was a fleeting feeling, but it was enough to remind him of the reason he fought. The war would end. And when it did, Otto would know that he had done his part. His small victories, his quiet defiance, had made a difference. As the train continued to move forward, its headlights cutting through the darkness, Otto's thoughts wandered back to the home he had left behind, to Maria and the children who awaited him. He could picture their faces in his mind's eye, the warmth of their embrace. It was that image, that feeling of home, that kept him going. The war was far from over, but in that moment, Otto knew that he was not just a worker. He was a part of something much larger than himself, a part of the fight to reclaim what had been lost, to rebuild what had been broken. And so, the train moved onward, cutting through the night like a thread weaving its way through the fabric of history, carrying Otto and his secrets toward an uncertain future. The train chugged through the darkness, its steady rhythm matching the thoughts swirling in Otto's mind. The faint glow of the engine's lights cut through the fog, illuminating the tracks ahead, but the night was deep, and the shadows stretched long, swallowing up everything beyond the reach of the light. The sound of the train's whistle broke the silence, a sharp, unmistakable note that echoed into the vast emptiness of the landscape. Each note was a reminder of his role, a role he had never asked for, but one that had become inescapable. Otto's hands gripped the wheel with the quiet confidence of a man who had done this for years. The cool metal felt familiar, like an old friend. He had driven trains before, through all kinds of weather, all kinds of conditions. But tonight was different. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. That gnawing sense of uncertainty that had settled in his chest ever since he had made the choice to become part of something much larger than himself. The resistance had found him, and though he had never sought to become part of it, he had known from the moment he agreed to help that his life would never be the same. Otto wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a spy. He was a conductor, one of the many unseen, unnoticed men and women who made the war machine run. But for the first time, he felt like he was more than just a cog in the system. He felt like he was a part of the pulse, the very heartbeat of the resistance, even though he was just another worker in the shadows, moving unnoticed through the dark. The trains were his responsibility. He understood the intricacies of the railway system better than anyone. He knew how to change the signals, how to divert the tracks without anyone noticing. And that knowledge had become his weapon. A simple change here, a slight alteration there, and suddenly, the Wehrmacht's supplies were lost, diverted, delayed. Every small act of sabotage mattered. Every train that went off course was a blow to the enemy. Every moment that Otto spent at the signal box, every switch he flipped, was a quiet victory in the larger battle. But even with all his knowledge, even with the responsibility he now carried, Otto felt the weight of fear. The Gestapo was everywhere. The men in black coats and sharp boots, always watching, always listening. They had ways of finding the smallest hint of rebellion, the smallest crack in the armor. He had seen what happened to those who were caught: prison camps, torture, and worse. The thought of what might happen to his family, to Maria and the children, was always there, lurking at the back of his mind. The war didn't just take lives. It took everything. The familiar world he had known before, the one where trains were just trains, and the world moved in predictable patterns, had been swept away by the horrors of war. In the midst of this chaos, Otto had found himself slipping deeper into the web of resistance. It wasn't something he had planned. It wasn't something he had sought. But once he had seen the faces of the people whose lives were being destroyed, once he had felt the weight of the bombs falling around him, it had been impossible to turn away. The first time he had changed a signal, it had been a small, almost insignificant act. But it had been a beginning, and it had led to more. More sabotage, more information, more risks. Each time the stakes grew higher. But each time Otto felt more certain that he was doing the right thing. The weather was turning colder now. The frost had begun to settle over the tracks, a thin veil of ice covering the metal like a second skin. The train's engine hissed as it moved through the night, its wheels screeching against the frozen rails. It was a familiar sound to Otto, one he had heard countless times over the years. But tonight, that sound felt different. It felt as though it were echoing through the very bones of the earth itself. The world was shifting beneath him, and he was caught in the currents, carried along whether he wanted to be or not. Otto's mind kept returning to the night when Jakob had approached him with the map. It had seemed like such a simple request at the time. Change the signals, reroute the trains, disrupt the enemy's supply lines. But now, as Otto sat at the controls of the train, the weight of that decision felt so much heavier. He wasn't just a conductor anymore. He was part of something larger, something that could change the course of history. But he didn't know if it was enough. The world felt so out of control. The war so all-encompassing. What could one man, even one man with the power to change a few tracks, do in the face of it all? Yet, despite the fear, Despite the doubts that gnawed at him, Otto knew that there was no going back. The train rumbled onward, its engine a constant hum in the background of his thoughts, and with each mile that passed, he felt the weight of his actions. They mattered. It wasn't much, but it mattered. Every signal changed, every track diverted, every small act of rebellion had the potential to alter the course of the war. It was in these small moments, in the quiet defiance of ordinary people, that the true fight was being waged. The cold night pressed in on him as Otto leaned back in his seat, the train steady beneath him. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks was like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring. It had become his anchor, his lifeline, in the storm of war that raged around him. But even in this moment of calm, he knew that there was danger ahead. The Luftwaffe could strike at any time. The Gestapo could be waiting, watching for any sign of rebellion. But still, he drove the train forward, his hand steady on the wheel. And in that moment, as the train powered through the night, Otto understood something profound. The world might have changed. The war might have stolen everything from him. But he still had a choice. He could still fight. And as the train continued its journey, Otto Weber, just a simple man in a world at war, knew that even the smallest acts of defiance could make a difference. The distant rumble of engines sounded overhead again, and Otto's gaze shifted upward, his thoughts lingering on the sky, on the unseen battles that raged above him. He couldn't see the bombers, but he could hear them, their engines a constant reminder that the war was never far from his doorstep. The train's whistle cut through the air, sharp and clear. And for a brief moment, it felt as though everything had settled into place. As the train continued its journey, Otto's thoughts turned once again to his family. Maria, his children. They were waiting for him, safe for the moment, but in this world, there was never any certainty. All he could do was keep moving forward, one train at a time, one signal at a time. In the quiet of the night, as the wheels turned beneath him, Otto felt a sense of peace settle over him, however fleeting. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. And as the train hurtled onward, its lights shining bright against the dark expanse of the night, Otto knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. Not for him. Not for anyone. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, the smallest acts of courage are the ones that matter most. The sound of the whistle pierced the cold night air, sharp and lonely, a reminder that Otto Weber was still on his mission. His hands, worn and calloused from years of working the rails, gripped the wheel of the train, feeling its steady pulse beneath him. The wheels clattered rhythmically against the tracks, as if they too understood the gravity of the moment. They were not just carrying coal or supplies tonight. They were carrying something far more valuable, a secret that could shift the tide of the war. The train passed through a landscape that had been scarred by war, the earth itself almost bearing witness to the battles that had been fought and lost. For weeks, Otto had steered his trains in the shadows of this conflict, quietly moving through enemy lines, making small but significant changes to the signals, shifting the course of history just a little bit at a time. Every turn of the switch, every change in direction, was a small victory against a force much greater than himself. And yet, tonight, Otto felt a sense of unease in the pit of his stomach. The sound of the train, which had once been a comfort, now seemed ominous. The war was drawing closer, and Otto had done everything he could to stay out of the direct path of the enemy. But no matter how far he went, no matter how many trains he rerouted or signals he altered, the war would always find its way to him. The German bombers, the Luftwaffe, had cast a long shadow over Europe. It was said that by 1943, the Luftwaffe had destroyed more than 40% of Britain's cities, London, Coventry, and Liverpool among them, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. And still, The war raged on. It was impossible to avoid it, impossible to ignore it. Even in the quiet moments, like this one, when Otto sat alone in the cab of his train, the constant hum of the engines could not drown out the memory of the bombs falling, the screams of those who had no place to run. But tonight, as the train glided through the darkened countryside, Otto was reminded of something else. The quiet resistance, the way the smallest actions could make a difference. His small part in this vast, unwieldy machine of war had begun to feel meaningful. And though he had never wanted to be part of something so dangerous, he knew that it was what had to be done. The train was his weapon. The signal box his battlefield, and every time he altered the course of a train, every time he sent a message to the resistance, he knew he was striking a blow at the heart of the enemy. Otto thought back to the first time Jakob had approached him with the map, the one that had led him down this path. Jakob, so young and full of idealism, had trusted him with a secret, a map that would allow Otto to alter the course of German trains, to send vital supplies off course, to create confusion and delay in the Wehrmacht's war machine. At first, Otto had hesitated. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't have a weapon. He was just a man, doing his job. But the more he thought about it, the more he understood that this was his way of fighting back. It wasn't a gun or a grenade. It was a signal, a small change in direction that could save lives. And that was enough. For the first few weeks, it had been easy. The trains were routine, the work simple. But with each passing day, Otto felt the pressure mounting. The SS were everywhere, watching, waiting for any sign of rebellion. He had learned to be careful, always careful. The trains ran on time. The signals were always changed in the dark of night when no one could see. The resistance had taught him how to hide his tracks, how to cover his movements. He wasn't alone. Not really. There were others, like Jakob, like the men and women who worked in the shadows of the war. But still, Otto knew that he was walking a fine line. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. The war had a way of changing things. It had changed the way people lived, the way they thought. But it had also changed Otto. Before the war, he had been a quiet man, content to work with his hands, to drive his trains and go home to his family. He hadn't asked for the war to find him, but it had, and now he was part of something much bigger than himself. He had become a small part of the resistance, a quiet warrior in a war of shadows. The days blurred together. The train track stretched out before him like an endless ribbon, winding through the hills and valleys, through cities and forests. Each time he passed through a station, Otto wondered if this would be the time, when the Gestapo would catch up with him, when his secret would be exposed, when his family would pay the price for his actions. He thought of Maria, his wife, and their children, safe at home, unaware of the danger he was facing. He had told them nothing. They couldn't know. The risk was too great. One night, as the train sped through the darkness, Otto was once again reminded of how fragile everything was. The war had brought uncertainty to every corner of the world, but it had also brought a sense of purpose. He had found a new rhythm, a new reason to keep moving forward. Each time he changed the signal, he thought of the lives that could be saved, the enemy that could be delayed. It wasn't much, but it was something. And still, the trains rolled on, the wheels turning with the rhythm of the war. The sound of the engine echoed through the night, a reminder of how far the world had come since the early days of the conflict. The Luftwaffe, though still formidable, had been challenged. The tide of the war had shifted. In 1943, the Germans had been driven back at Stalingrad, a turning point that signaled the beginning of the end. The Soviets had proven their strength, and the Allies were beginning to find their footing. The Blitz, though devastating, had failed to break the spirit of the British people. But despite these victories, the war was far from over. The struggle continued, and Otto knew that the work was not done. As the train rattled on through the night, Otto's thoughts returned to Jakob, to the other members of the resistance who were working tirelessly in the shadows. He thought of the small victories, the quiet moments of triumph that were never acknowledged. They would never be in the history books. Those moments. There would be no medals, no parades, no fanfare. But Otto knew that those small acts of resistance, those quiet, hidden victories, were what had kept the war alive, what had kept hope alive in the hearts of the people who fought, not with guns or bombs, but with small acts of defiance. The train's whistle sounded again, a sharp, unmistakable cry in the night, and Otto sat up straighter, his hand steady on the controls. He wasn't just a conductor. He wasn't just a man carrying cargo from one place to another. He was part of something much larger, something that had the power to change the course of the war. And for the first time in months, Otto felt a flicker of hope. The war wasn't over yet. But it would be, and he would have played his part in making sure of it. As the train continued to roll on, Otto leaned back in his seat, the sound of the wheels on the tracks a constant, soothing rhythm. The night stretched on, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. It was fleeting, but it was enough. The train carried on, and Otto Weber, just one man in the vast machine of war, knew that, in his own way, he had made a difference. The war would end. The trains would stop. And when that day came, Otto would know that he had done his part, no matter how small, to help change the world. And so, with a final glance at the tracks ahead, Otto let the night settle around him, the steady hum of the engine and the sound of the train's whistle filling the space between him and everything that had come before. The world was still out there, waiting. But for now, in the quiet of the train, Otto knew that he had done something that mattered. The war had taken its toll on everything it touched, the land, the people, the very air they breathed. It was as though the world itself had been rewritten in chaos, and Otto Weber was just one small part of that. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel of the train, the vibrations of the engine running through his body as though they were connected in some unspoken way. Each turn of the wheel, each shift in direction, was more than just a routine. It was a deliberate act of defiance in the face of an enemy that seemed to have swallowed everything whole. It was almost too much to bear at times, the enormity of what he was doing. But he had no choice. The war didn't care about choice. It demanded action. And Otto had answered. It was late 1943 now, and the world had begun to shift. The Wehrmacht's relentless push across Europe had stalled on the Eastern Front. The Germans had failed to break through in Stalingrad, and the Soviet Union was rising from the ashes of what had seemed like a hopeless situation. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Allies were slowly gaining ground, and the Luftwaffe was no longer the uncontested ruler of the skies. The bombing campaigns had begun to take a toll on the German Air Force, and the once feared blitzkrieg had slowed, the momentum of the Wehrmacht faltering as it faced resistance from unexpected places. Places like Otto's small corner of the world. For Otto, it had never been about victory on the battlefield or glory in combat. He was just a worker, a man who ran trains from one station to the next, carrying cargo, passengers, and sometimes something far more valuable, a small piece of the puzzle that would one day turn the tide of the war. His train had carried more than coal and steel. It had carried secrets, messages hidden in plain sight, whispers of hope for those who needed it most. Every night, he ran his route in the stillness of the night, the sound of the train's whistle cutting through the quiet of the countryside. The rhythm of the train's wheels on the tracks was like a heartbeat, steady and unwavering. But as the months had passed, Otto had come to realize that the steady beat of the train was a far cry from the steady march of history. The war had taken on a life of its own, its momentum unstoppable. But even in the midst of that force, Otto had made his stand in the only way he knew how, by changing the course of the trains, one signal at a time. The sound of engines had become a constant presence in the skies. The Luftwaffe's bombers, their engines roaring like distant thunder, were always overhead, always just out of sight, but never far away. Otto knew that every time he set the switches, every time he rerouted a train, he was making a difference, no matter how small. But it had never been about grand gestures. It had been about survival, about doing what he could, in whatever way he could, to resist the machine that sought to destroy everything. And there, in the quiet of his train's cabin, in the isolation of his work, Otto had learned to live with that sense of defiance. It was a feeling that came in waves, quiet moments of reflection, followed by the rush of adrenaline as the train sped through the night. In those moments, Otto didn't think about the war, didn't think about the danger, didn't think about the Gestapo lurking in the shadows. He thought only of the work at hand, the train, the track, the signal. The nights had grown colder, the fog more persistent, but Otto had learned to find solace in the routine. He could hear the clattering of the train's wheels as they rolled across the rails, the screeching of metal as it grinded against the track. He could smell the sharp scent of coal smoke filling the air, the bitter tang of oil and grease, and in the far-off distance, the faint scent of the countryside, grass, earth, rain. It was a strange comfort, in a way, the smells of industry and nature mixing in his nostrils, a reminder that even in the chaos of war, life was still happening. People were still living. But there were moments when the weight of what Otto was doing became almost too much to bear. The signals, the trains, the constant worry that one mistake would end it all, that one slip of the hand would lead to a deadly consequence. He had seen the reports of the resistance fighters who had been caught, their names dragged through the mud by the Gestapo. The punishments they faced, torture, execution, families torn apart, were enough to make anyone question whether it was worth it. But Otto had never been one to back down. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. It had become a way of life for him now, this quiet rebellion. He didn't see himself as a hero. He wasn't leading armies or fighting on the front lines. He was just a man who had seen too much, who had lost too much, to sit back and let the war happen around him. He was part of the machinery, yes, but in his small corner of the world, he was making a difference. The trains that passed through his station were part of a much larger system, and he, in his quiet way, had found a way to disrupt it. He wasn't alone, of course. There were others, people who worked in factories, people who ran the railroads, people who lived their lives in the shadows, doing their part in small, subtle ways. And yet, even as Otto carried out his duties, even as he changed the course of the trains, a part of him always feared what would come next. The Gestapo had begun to watch more closely. They had become aware of the small acts of defiance, the subtle changes in the flow of supplies. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed what was happening, before they put the pieces together. And when that day came, when they came for Otto, he would have nowhere to hide. But Otto knew that he couldn't stop now. He couldn't just walk away from the resistance, from the chance to make a difference. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been hurt by the war, about the people who had lost everything. It was about Maria and the children. It was about the future of the country. So, he continued, each night, the same as the last, the same as the next. One foot in front of the other. One signal after another. And through it all, Otto never lost sight of the reason he did it. To push back, to fight in whatever small way he could, against the crushing force of the war. As the train moved forward, its wheels clattering across the tracks, Otto thought of the men and women who had come before him. The heroes who had fought on the front lines, who had risked everything for the cause. They had given everything, and now it was his turn. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a general, he was just a conductor, driving his train through the night. But in that quiet, steady movement, he was making a difference. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The rumble of the train grew louder as it moved through the darkness, and Otto's gaze softened, the tension in his chest slowly easing. The war was still far from over. But for a brief moment, in the stillness of the train, with the weight of the world pressing down on him, Otto Weber allowed himself to believe that, somehow, the world would be okay. The battle was not yet won, but the fight would continue, and he would fight too, just as he had always done.